Every second a name is written down, not after death but before it happens. Ancient texts describe a record that already knows when you will die, how it will happen, and at what hour. No warning. No delay. Civilizations referenced it. Scholars avoided explaining it. No one was meant to see it. If this record exists, then free will, chance, and accident may be illusions. And the most disturbing part is this: the list may still be growing. The first appearance in written sources. In early Islamic texts, death is described in administrative terms rather than symbolic language. The Quran refers to an angel of death who is assigned to human beings and who carries out the taking of life at a designated time. One commonly cited verse states that this angel is responsible for collecting souls and that each person is then returned to God. The wording does not provide physical detail, personal attributes, or narrative background. It presents the role as a defined function within a larger system. Another Quranic passage states that no person dies except by God's permission at a fixed term. Classical Arabic grammar in this verse uses language associated with appointment and scheduling. Early commentators such as Al-Tabari, who lived between 839 and 923 CE, interpreted this phrasing as indicating a predetermined lifespan known within divine knowledge. In his multi-volume tafsir, Al-Tabari records earlier scholarly opinions that emphasize timing rather than cause. Illness, accident, or violence are treated as secondary to the appointed limit. These passages form the earliest textual foundation for later discussions about death records in Islamic tradition. They establish three elements: an assigned agent, a fixed term, and divine authorization. None of these verses mention a name, a physical book, or a written register. They describe process rather than storage. The name Azrael does not appear in the Quran. It also does not appear in the most widely accepted collections of prophetic traditions, including Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. Later legal and theological scholars, including Ibn Taymiyyah in the 14th century, noted this absence when discussing angelology. They stated that while the role of the angel of death is confirmed by scripture, the personal name is not established through primary sources. The earliest appearances of the name Azrael are found in later Islamic literature influenced by Jewish and Christian traditions circulating in the Near East during the early medieval period. Hebrew texts from earlier centuries refer to a figure called Azrael or Azrael associated with death. Scholars of comparative religion, including Gershom Scholem in the 20th century, traced this name through rabbinic writings and apocryphal material that predate Islam. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Muslim historians and storytellers had begun incorporating similar names into biographical and cosmological works. Authors such as Al-Thalabi, who died in 1035, included references to angels by name in his collections of prophetic stories. These works were not legal texts and were not treated as sources of religious rulings. They functioned as narrative compilations meant to preserve popular and semi-learned traditions. Within this literature, Azrael appears as a named figure associated with the Quranic angel of death. Some accounts describe him as having assistants. Others mention that he is informed of deaths in advance. A few refer to a written record or list connected to his task. These references are not uniform. They differ in wording, detail, and emphasis depending on the author and region. One example appears in later versions of Qisas al-Anbiya, a genre of prophetic biographies circulated between the 10th and 15th centuries. Certain manuscripts describe angels consulting records when carrying out divine commands. These passages are not attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and are not presented as revealed text. They are framed as inherited reports. The idea of a written register of lives is not unique to Islamic tradition. In Jewish scripture, the Book of Life appears in several passages, including the Book of Psalms and the Book of Daniel. Christian texts also refer to heavenly books that record deeds and names. Late antique scholars have documented how these concepts circulated through shared linguistic and cultural environments in the Eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. Early Muslim scholars were aware of these parallel traditions. Some accepted limited material from earlier communities, known as Israeliyat, when it did not conflict with Islamic doctrine. Others rejected it entirely. As a result, references to death registers appear sporadically and without institutional endorsement. By the 12th century, encyclopedic works began systematizing knowledge about angels. One example is the cosmological writing attributed to Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, who died in 1210. In his discussions of unseen beings, al-Razi summarizes earlier views without affirming specific narrative details. He states that angels operate according to assigned roles and that their knowledge derives from divine instruction, not independent record-keeping. Manuscript evidence from this period reflects how these ideas circulated. Surviving copies of angelological treatises from Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad include marginal notes where later readers questioned or qualified certain descriptions. Some margins contain phrases such as "no reliable chain" or "from storytellers," indicating skepticism. Libraries in Istanbul, Cairo, and Tehran preserve thousands of such manuscripts. Catalogue records from the Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul list multiple copies of medieval cosmological texts that mention the Angel of Death. None of these catalogues identify a single work devoted exclusively to a book listing every death. Instead, references appear as brief passages within larger compilations. The administrative image of a list or register reflects broader practices in medieval Islamic societies. State institutions maintain detailed records of taxation, military service, land ownership, and court judgments. The Abbasid bureaucracy in Baghdad during the 9th century developed advanced systems of documentation. Surviving papyri from Egypt show standardized formats for recording names and dates. Historians such as Hugh Kennedy have noted that record-keeping became a defining feature of Islamic governance. This environment shaped how religious concepts were expressed. Abstract ideas were often described using familiar bureaucratic models. Authority was associated with documentation. Accuracy was associated with written registers. Within this context, describing death as something already recorded followed existing patterns of thought. A life had a term was known, knowledge was preserved. Whether that preservation was imagined as a tablet, a scroll, or a register depended on the author. Later Ottoman-era scholars continued this restrained approach. Writers such as Khatib Chelebi in the 17th century summarized angelological traditions while emphasizing the limits of reliable transmission. He cited earlier sources but avoided endorsing unverified narratives. Modern Islamic legal websites and scholarly institutions maintain the same distinction. Contemporary fatwa collections state that belief in the Angel of Death is required, based on Quranic evidence. They also state that details about his name or personal records are not established through sound sources. Academic studies of Islamic angelology published in the 20th and 21st centuries reflect this consensus. Works by scholars such as Jane Idleman Smith and David Cook describe Azrael as a figure shaped by later tradition rather than early revelation. These studies rely on manuscript analysis and citation tracing. In university archives, references to death registers are categorized as part of popular religious literature. They are studied as cultural artifacts rather than doctrinal statements. Researchers examine how ideas moved between languages and communities and how they were adapted over time. The earliest written sources, when examined in chronological order, show a gradual layering process. Quranic verses establish function and timing. Early commentators clarify meaning. Later storytellers introduce names. Some writers add images of records, others question those additions. No single stage produces a standardized book that can be traced to an original text. What remains consistent across centuries is the emphasis on order. Death is described as regulated. It is assigned. It follows a schedule. It does not occur randomly within the theological framework. This language appears in scripture, commentary, and legal writing. The circulation of an unverified name. In the manuscript rooms of major Middle Eastern libraries, short notes written in faded ink often sit beside formal religious text. These marginal remarks sometimes correct dates, sometimes question sources, and sometimes express uncertainty about a single word. In several preserved volumes dealing with angels and cosmology, the word Azrael appears with such markings, set apart from the surrounding passages. The presence of these annotations shows that readers were aware that some names required careful treatment. Religious scripture itself presents angels by responsibility rather than by personal identity. Gabriel is associated with revelation. Michael is associated with provision. The angel of death is identified only through duty. No personal name is attached to this role in the Quran. This pattern remains consistent throughout the text. The major collections of prophetic traditions compiled in the 9th century follow the same approach. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, which together contain thousands of reports, do not assign a name to the angel of death. Later commentators such as al-Nawawi and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who analysed these collections in detail, did not record any authenticated narration providing such a name. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Islamic writing had expanded into historical, biographical, and narrative genres. These works aimed to preserve broad cultural knowledge rather than establish legal rulings. Within this environment, authors began to record angelic names that did not appear in foundational texts. Al-Thalabi, who died in 1035 inches Nishapur, compiled extensive collections of religious narratives. His writings include references to Azrael in connection with death. These passages are presented as inherited reports rather than prophetic statements. Al-Thalabi often cites unnamed transmitters and earlier storytellers as sources. Similar references appear in works attributed to Al-Kisai and in later Qisas al-Anbiya compilations. These texts circulated widely between the 11th and 15th centuries. Manuscripts were copied in Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad, and Konya. Colophons and ownership notes in surviving copies show that these books were read in both scholarly and popular settings. The linguistic origin of the name points beyond Islamic scripture. Hebrew and Aramaic religious texts from late antiquity contain references to a figure called Azrael. These writings associate the name with death and judgment. Scholars have identified parallels between these earlier sources and later Islamic narratives. During the expansion of Muslim societies across the Near East, interaction with Jewish and Christian communities was continuous. Converts, scholars, and traders carried stories across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Some of this material entered Islamic literature as supplementary reports, later classified as Israeliyat. Classical scholars addressed these reports with varying levels of caution. Ibn Kathir, who died in 1373, discussed Israeliyat in his Quranic commentary. He stated that such material could be mentioned for background, but should not be treated as verified knowledge. He included angelic names among examples requiring restraint. Al-Qurtubi, who died in 1273 inches Cordoba, adopted a similar approach. In his extensive Quranic commentary, he discussed death and angels without naming the angel of death. He noted that some people used the name Azrael but emphasized the absence of reliable chains of transmission. Theological writings from this period show a consistent concern with verification. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, who died in 1210, summarized different views about angels while distinguishing between confirmed teachings and narrative additions. He did not affirm specific names that lacked primary support. Manuscripts copied during the Mamluk and early Ottoman periods preserve evidence of this caution. In several cosmological and devotional works, later scribes added marginal comments questioning unsupported claims. Some notes use brief phrases such as weak report or without source. Legal scholars reinforced these distinctions. Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1328, wrote that belief should be limited to what is established in reliable texts. He warned against affirming details about unseen matters without evidence. His writings circulated widely and influenced later creedal formulations. Despite scholarly restraint, the name Azrael became common in sermons, poetry, and devotional literature. These genres prioritized accessibility and memorability. A named figure was easier to reference than an abstract function. Over time, repetition in public settings increased familiarity. Ottoman religious culture reflected this division. Formal legal manuals and creeds avoided unverified details. Popular ethics books and story collections used the name freely. Printing presses in Istanbul and Cairo during the 19th century reproduced both types of works, reinforcing parallel traditions. Reformist scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries addressed this issue in public writings. Muhammad Abduh and Rashid Rida emphasized returning to primary texts. In articles published in Al-Manar, they cited angel names as examples of inherited material lacking firm evidence. Modern academic studies have documented this transmission process. Researchers analyzing manuscript lineages found that references to Azrael consistently originate in narrative literature. Peer-reviewed studies and Islamic studies journals trace how the name moved through Persian, Arabic, and Turkish texts. University courses on Islamic theology now present this case as an illustration of layered tradition. Students examine how names enter circulation through storytelling and repetition. Textbooks distinguish between doctrinal foundations and later cultural elements. Contemporary religious authorities maintain the same position. Official rulings issued by major fatwa institutions state that belief in the angel of death is required, based on Quranic evidence, while the personal name remains unconfirmed. These rulings cite classical scholars as precedent. Digital manuscript repositories have strengthened this analysis. Online databases allow researchers to compare copies from different centuries. When passages mentioning Azrael are mapped across collections, they appear concentrated in specific genres and absent in others. How records were described in scholarly texts. Certain terms appear repeatedly in titles and marginal notes in catalogues of medieval Islamic manuscripts. Words such as kitab, lawa, suhuf, and daftar are used to indicate different forms of written material. Each carries a specific historical meaning. Kitab refers broadly to a book. La refers to a tablet. Suhuf indicates sheets or scrolls. Daftar denotes a register or ledger. These terms formed the vocabulary through which scholars discussed records, both earthly and unseen. When Quranic verses refer to divine knowledge, they often use language connected to writing. Several passages speak of deeds being recorded and preserved. Classical grammarians analyze these verses carefully, focusing on verb forms that imply inscription and preservation. They treated these terms as indicators of order rather than physical description. One frequently cited concept is al-law, al-mahfuz, the preserved tablet. The phrase appears in Quranic exegesis beginning in the early Abbasid period. Early commentators such as Mujahid ibn Jabr, who died in 722, and Qatada ibn Di'ama, who died in 736, transmitted interpretations that described it as a repository of divine knowledge. These explanations were preserved in later tafsir works. Al-Tabari's commentary, completed in the early 10th century, records multiple opinions on the meaning of the preserved tablet. Some scholars understood it as a literal tablet. Others interpreted it as a metaphor for comprehensive knowledge. Al-Tabari presented these views without selecting one as definitive. He documented transmission chains and left evaluation to the reader. Later commentators continued this method. Al-Zamakhshari, who died in 1144, emphasized linguistic analysis. In his interpretation, the imagery of tablets and writings served to communicate permanence and certainty. He did not describe physical dimensions or location. His focus remained on meaning rather than form. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi expanded these discussions in the 13th century. In his theological works, he examined philosophical questions about knowledge and recording. He argued that divine knowledge does not require physical media. At the same time, he acknowledged that scripture uses material metaphors to make abstract ideas accessible. Similar treatment appears in the writings of al-Baydawi and al-Nasafi in the 13th and 14th centuries. Their commentaries summarized earlier views and emphasized that references to writing should not be understood through direct analogy with human books. They treated inscription as a conceptual framework rather than a physical process. Alongside tafsir literature, works of creed address the subject of divine records. Texts such as al-Tahawi's Creed, written in the 10th century, affirmed belief in predestination and divine knowledge without elaborating on recording mechanisms. Later commentaries on this creed, including those by Ibn Abi al-Izir in the 14th century, discussed tablets and records as part of this doctrine. In legal theory, references to divine records appear indirectly. Usul al-Fiqh texts focus on evidence, transmission, and documentation. Scholars trained in these disciplines developed strong habits of source verification. This methodological culture influenced how theological concepts were discussed. Claims about unseen records were expected to align with established texts. Historical writing also reflects these patterns. Ibn Khaldun, who died in 1406, addressed religious concepts within his sociological framework. In the Muqaddimah, he referred to predestination and divine knowledge in general terms. He did not elaborate on specific forms of record-keeping. His approach prioritized observable social processes. Manuscript evidence shows that discussions of divine inscription were often placed within broader cosmological chapters. Works on creation, angels, and eschatology typically included sections on tablets and registers. These sections were usually brief. They cited Quranic verses and early interpretations, then moved on. One example is the cosmological encyclopedia Ajaib al-Makhlukat by al-Qazwini, who died in 1283. This widely copied work contains descriptions of angels and celestial structures. Some versions mention heavenly records. The language remains general and avoids technical detail. Surviving copies from Iran, Anatolia, and Egypt show consistent wording. Sufi literature approached the subject differently. Mystical authors such as al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, discussed divine knowledge in terms of inner awareness and spiritual insight. In Ihya Ulum al-Din, al-Ghazali referred to records metaphorically, linking them to conscience and accountability. He did not describe physical objects. Later, Sufi writers, including Ibn Arabi in the 13th century, developed complex metaphysical systems. In his writings, the preserved tablet appears as part of a symbolic cosmology. Scholars studying his work emphasize that these descriptions are philosophical constructions, rather than literal claims. Court records and administrative documents from medieval Islamic states provide an important parallel. Abbasid, Fatimid, and Mamluk governments maintained detailed registers of taxation, property, and military service. Surviving papyri and parchments from Egypt show standardized layouts and formulaic language. These documents familiarized educated readers with the concept of comprehensive registers. Ottoman archival practices continued this tradition. From the 15th century onward, the empire maintained centralized defter registers. These recorded landholdings, population data, and fiscal obligations. Historians have documented how these systems shaped administrative thinking across society. Scholars living within these bureaucratic environments naturally drew on familiar models when discussing abstract order. A register implied completeness, a tablet implied permanence, a book implied authority. These associations informed religious language without requiring physical confirmation. By the 17th century, encyclopedic authors such as Khatib Chelebi summarized earlier theological discussions. In Kashf al-Zunan, he catalogued works on creed and cosmology, noting how different authors treated divine records. His work reflects awareness of multiple interpretive traditions. Printing technology in the 19th century expanded access to classical texts. Commentaries on tablets and registers were reproduced in Cairo, Beirut, and Istanbul. Standardized editions reduced textual variation and reinforced established interpretations. Modern academic studies have examined these materials through philological methods. Researchers compare manuscript variants to track how terms related to inscription were transmitted. Studies published in journals of Islamic studies show that references to divine records remain remarkably stable across centuries. Contemporary Quranic commentaries written in Arabic, Turkish, and Urdu continue this restrained approach. They cite early authorities and avoid speculative detail. Explanations focus on moral accountability and divine knowledge, rather than physical description. Educational curricula and religious seminaries reflect the same pattern. Students study tafsir passages related to writing and recording. Teachers emphasize established interpretations and discourage imaginative elaboration. Examination materials rarely include questions about physical aspects of heavenly records. Digital humanities projects have further clarified this continuity. Online databases allow scholars to search thousands of texts for key terms such as law and kitab. Results show consistent usage patterns tied to specific genres and periods. Across tafsir, creed, history, and mysticism, the same methodological restraint appears. Authors documented transmitted views, evaluated sources, and avoided detailed description where evidence was absent. This practice maintained stability in theological language. The vocabulary of inscription thus developed within clear boundaries. Tablets, books, and registers functioned as explanatory devices shaped by administrative culture and textual tradition. They conveyed order without requiring visualization. Manuscripts, margins, and silent corrections. Scholars often encounter pages where the main text occupies only part of the surface. The remaining space is filled with smaller handwriting added by later readers. These marginal notes appear in different inks and scripts, sometimes separated by decades or centuries. In works dealing with angels, predestination, and divine knowledge, these additions frequently address questions of reliability and wording. Islamic manuscripts were rarely static objects. After a text was copied, it continued to be read, annotated, and compared with other versions. Students added glosses, teachers corrected phrases, owners recorded disagreements. Over time, a single volume accumulated layers of interpretation. Many surviving theological manuscripts from Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad contain marginal remarks next to passages discussing unseen matters. These notes often identify weak transmission chains, alternative readings, or uncertain attributions. In some cases, a single word is circled and followed by a short comment such as "not established" or "reported without proof." The practice of marginal correction developed early. By the 9th century, Hadith scholars were already marking manuscripts to indicate unreliable narrators or variant wording. This habit spread to other disciplines, including tafsir and theology. Marginal space became a controlled area for scholarly dialogue. One example can be found in copies of Al-Tabari's Quranic commentary preserved in Istanbul and Cairo. In sections discussing divine decree and recording, later readers added references to other commentators. Some notes cite Al-Qutubi or Ibn Kathir. Others simply state, "compare with another copy," indicating an ongoing process of verification. Colophons at the end of manuscripts provide additional evidence. These closing notes often record the name of the copyist, the date of completion, and the place of writing. Some also include statements such as "corrected against the author's version" or "reviewed by a teacher." These remarks show that accuracy was treated as a collective responsibility. These remarks, during the Mamluk period, organized study circles developed around major mosques. Students copied texts under supervision and compared their work with authorized exemplars. Surviving manuscripts from Al-Azhar and the Umayyad mosque libraries show consistent patterns of cross-checking. Marginal symbols indicate where passages were reviewed. Ottoman scholars inherited these practices. In Istanbul, endowment libraries maintained reference copies of important works. Readers were encouraged to consult these when copying or studying. Some volumes in the Suleymaniye library contain multiple layers of marginalia from different centuries, reflecting continuous engagement. Corrections were not always written openly. In some manuscripts, questionable passages are lightly crossed out without replacement. In others, a word is scraped away and rewritten. Paleographic analysis shows that these alterations were often made carefully to preserve readability. In works mentioning angels and divine records, such silent corrections are common. Passages containing speculative detail are more likely to show signs of revision. Later readers sometimes removed descriptive phrases and replaced them with more general wording drawn from earlier authorities. Manuscript comparison projects have documented this pattern. Researchers who examined parallel copies of cosmological texts found that later versions often contain fewer narrative embellishments. Over successive generations, language tends to become more restrained rather than more elaborate. Private study notebooks provide further insight. Scholars kept personal collections of excerpts known as majmu'at. These notebooks often include copied passages with personal comments in the margins. Some entries note disagreements with popular stories about angels, labeling them as from storytellers or common speech. The transmission of these notes influenced later copies. When students learned from annotated manuscripts, they absorbed both the main text and the marginal judgments. Over time, critical remarks became part of the scholarly tradition, even if they were never formalized in print. Printing did not immediately end this practice. Early Arabic printed books of the 19th century sometimes reproduced marginal notes alongside the main text. Publishers in Cairo and Beirut included footnotes derived from manuscript glosses. These notes preserved earlier corrections. One example is the Bulaq press edition of Al-Qurtubi's commentary, published in the mid-19th century. It contains footnotes identifying weak reports and disputed names. Editors drew these notes from earlier manuscript traditions rather than creating new commentary. Modern cataloguing projects have made marginal material more visible. Digital scans allow researchers to zoom in on small annotations. Databases now index marginalia separately from main texts. This has revealed how frequently scholars question descriptions of unseen matters. Studies conducted at institutions such as Leiden University and SOAS have shown that marginal corrections cluster around specific themes. Angels, predestination, and eschatology generate more annotations than legal rulings or grammar. These areas were treated with particular caution. Training in manuscript reading remains part of advanced Islamic studies programs. Students learn to identify layers of handwriting, ink composition, and script style. Through this training, they see how earlier scholars monitored each other's claims. Interviews with contemporary manuscript conservators in Istanbul and Tehran indicate that many volumes show evidence of repeated review. Marginalia were rarely erased. They were preserved as part of the intellectual history of the text. These practices created a slow filtering process. Unsupported material was not always removed immediately. Instead, it was marked, questioned, and gradually de-emphasized through copying. Over generations, this reduced the prominence of speculative descriptions. The study of margins reveals a quiet form of regulation. No centralized authority issued bans. Instead, individual scholars recorded doubts in writing. These doubts accumulated and shaped later transmission. Within texts discussing divine records and angels, this process maintained methodological boundaries. Readers were reminded where evidence ended and narration began. The physical page became a space for that reminder. Manuscripts therefore functioned as living documents. They carried both information and evaluation. Through marginal notes, corrections, and silent edits, scholars preserved restraint in areas where certainty was limited, court registers and administrative parallels. In provincial court buildings from Cairo to Sarajevo, wooden cabinets once held bundles of folded paper tied with string. Each bundle contained legal records arranged by date and subject. Judges and clerks knew which cabinet held inheritance files, which contained land disputes, and which preserved tax assessments. Access to these papers determined whether a claim could be verified or dismissed. The word defter entered Ottoman Turkish from Persian, where daftar referred to a ledger or register. Earlier Arabic sources used terms such as diwan for administrative record books. By the 9th century, Abbasid governance in Baghdad relied on diwans to track salaries, military rosters, and land taxation. Surviving papyri from Egypt show comparable record systems with dated entries and official seals. These bureaucratic practices were not incidental. They formed the operational foundation of medieval Islamic states. The Abbasid Diwan al-Jund recorded soldiers' stipends. The Diwan al-Kharaj tracked agricultural tax obligations. Officials maintained cross-reference lists to ensure accuracy. Errors could result in financial loss or disciplinary action. Historians such as Hugh Kennedy and Petrus Sijpestein have examined surviving fragments of these records. Their research shows standardized formulas for names, patronymics, and geographic identifiers. Administrative writing emphasized clarity and reproducibility. Each entry could be verified against others. In the Mamluk period, similar systems operated in Cairo. Land surveys documented property boundaries and ownership changes. Court records recorded marriage contracts, inheritances, and commercial disputes. Registers were stored in designated repositories attached to judicial offices. The Ottoman Empire expanded this model on a larger scale. Beginning in the 15th century, comprehensive land surveys known as Tariya Defterleri were conducted throughout Anatolia and the Balkans. These surveys listed villages, households, and taxable resources. Each region's data was copied into centralized archives. Modern archival catalogues classify thousands of these volumes. Researchers studying demographic history rely on them to reconstruct population patterns. The consistency of layout across regions indicates a standardized administrative culture. Court registers also documented life events. Births were less systematically recorded than property transactions, but inheritance proceedings required precise documentation of death. When an individual died, heirs appeared before a judge. Their testimony was entered into the court register, establishing legal succession. Sharia court archives from Jerusalem, Cairo, and Damascus preserve such entries from the 16th through 19th centuries. Each entry includes the deceased's name, the date, and the division of assets. These records reflect how death triggered immediate administrative action. The vocabulary used in these documents parallels religious language about recording. Terms for writing, registering, and preserving appear in both contexts. The act of inscription signified recognition and accountability. A name written into a register acquired legal standing. Scholars living within these bureaucratic environments were familiar with this system. Many theologians also served as judges or administrators. Their exposure to organized record-keeping influenced the metaphors available to them. When religious texts referred to deeds being written or preserved, readers understood the implications. A recorded act implied permanence and review. Just as court entries could be consulted later, recorded deeds were described as retrievable. This parallel does not indicate that religious doctrine derived directly from state practice. Rather, it shows that administrative culture provided a language framework. The concept of a register was part of daily experience for educated classes. Comparative studies of papyri and theological texts highlight this convergence. For example, Abbasid-era papyri from Fustat include phrases meaning entered into the register or recorded in the diwan. Similar verbs appear in Quranic exegesis discussing divine inscription. The shared vocabulary reinforced conceptual associations. Ottoman administrative manuals further illustrate the importance of documentation. Guides for provincial officials instructed them on maintaining accurate registers and updating entries after significant events. These manuals survive in manuscript and printed form. European travellers who visited Ottoman archives in the 17th century remarked on the volume of records preserved. Their accounts describe shelves of bound Defter volumes organised by province and date. The impression conveyed is one of systematic preservation. Modern historians analysing these archives note the continuity between medieval and early modern practices. Registers were rarely discarded. Older volumes were stored even after becoming obsolete. Preservation served both legal and institutional memory. The habit of maintaining comprehensive records shaped broader intellectual expectations. Information that mattered was expected to be written down. Accuracy required inscription. Oral knowledge, while respected, was reinforced by documentation. Theological discussions of divine knowledge operated within this cultural landscape. When commentators described deeds being recorded, readers did not require physical visualization. The concept of a register already carried practical meaning. Archival research conducted in Cairo's Dar al-Wathaiq and Istanbul's Ottoman archives shows that court scribes followed strict conventions. Margins were ruled, dates were standardized. Witnesses were named explicitly. These conventions ensured traceability. Scholars trained in law absorbed these conventions during their education. Manuals on legal procedure included chapters on documentation. Students learned how to draft contracts and verify signatures. These skills paralleled interpretive habits in theology. The interplay between administrative order and religious language therefore developed gradually. Registers symbolized completeness and review. They provided a model for understanding accountability without specifying physical form. Contemporary historians caution against direct causal claims. Administrative systems and theological metaphors evolved in overlapping but distinct spheres. Nonetheless, documentary evidence demonstrates that record-keeping was deeply embedded in social life. Digital humanities projects have mapped Ottoman Defter entries geographically, revealing networks of villages and tax districts. These visualizations underscore the scale of documentation. Tens of thousands of names appear in a single survey. Within this environment, the metaphor of inscription required no elaboration. It was part of institutional reality. Religious language adopted familiar terms to describe order and knowledge. The survival of these registers into the present provides tangible evidence of administrative continuity. They illustrate how writing structured governance and social relations. The concept of a record became associated with legitimacy and permanence. Theological texts referencing divine recording emerged alongside these practices. Readers encountering such language understood it through lived experience of registers and court entries. The shared vocabulary bridged practical administration and abstract belief, predestination and measured time. On stone walls in historic cemeteries across North Africa and Anatolia, inscriptions are carved with consistent formulas. A name is followed by lineage, then a date expressed in lunar months and years. Some stones include the day of the week, others record only the year. These markings were intended to situate a life within an exact temporal frame. Visitors were expected to understand the meaning of these numbers without explanation. Religious scholars worked within societies where such chronological awareness was routine. Calendars regulated prayer times, fasting periods, pilgrimage seasons, court sessions, and taxation cycles. Mosques employed timekeepers to calculate lunar visibility. Astronomers produced tables used by judges and administrators. Accurate dating was a practical necessity. Within this environment, theological discussions about destiny and lifespan developed in measured language. Quranic passages refer repeatedly to an appointed term for individuals and communities. The Arabic word ajal appears in contexts involving death, punishment, and historical decline. Classical lexicographers such as Ibn Manzur defined ajal as a fixed endpoint rather than an estimated duration. Early commentators analyzed these verses through transmitted interpretation and linguistic study. Mujahid ibn Jabr, who died in 722, explained ajal as a determined limit known to God. Qatada ibn Di'ama, who died in 736, expressed similar views in reports preserved by later scholars. These interpretations appear in early tafsir compilations and remained influential. Al-Tabari's commentary, completed in the early 10th century, documents multiple positions on predestination and timing. Some scholars emphasized divine foreknowledge, others focused on divine decree. Al-Tabari preserved these views with their chains of transmission and did not impose a single interpretation. His method reflected prevailing scholarly practice. By the 10th century, formal theological schools had emerged. The Ash'ari and Maturidi traditions articulated structured doctrines on divine determination and human action. Both affirmed that lifespans are fixed by divine will while maintaining moral responsibility. Their creeds avoided detailed explanation of how timing is implemented. A central reference in this tradition is the creed of Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, written in the early 10th century. It affirms belief in divine decree concerning benefit and harm, life and death, without elaboration. Later commentators expanded on these statements through textual and logical analysis. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi examined predestination using philosophical reasoning. In his theological works, he discussed causation, sequence, and contingency. He argued that time-bound events occur according to divine knowledge and structured order, even when proximate causes appear variable. His analysis drew on earlier Islamic philosophy and Aristotelian logic. Legal scholars approach these issues indirectly through judicial rulings. Courts distinguish between deliberate harm, accidental injury, and natural death. Each category carried specific legal consequences. These distinctions presuppose that death occurs within a determined framework, while human actions remain legally accessible. Historical writing reflects similar assumptions. Chroniclers such as Ibn al-Athir and al-Dahabi recorded deaths with precise dates and locations. Their biographical dictionaries list birth and death years alongside scholarly achievements. Lifespan is presented as a measurable interval rather than a narrative motif. Astronomical and mathematical literature reinforce this perspective. Scholars such as al-Biruni developed detailed methods for calculating calendars and celestial cycles. His works compared Persian, Greek, Indian, and Islamic systems of chronology. These studies emphasized that time could be analyzed systematically. Medical writing addressed lifespan from another angle. Physicians such as Ibn Sina discussed longevity in relation to bodily balance, climate, and diet. While explaining physiological causes, they acknowledged theological doctrines of appointed terms. Medical and religious models coexisted without formal conflict. Theological debates over predestination intensified in certain periods. During the 9th and 10th centuries, disputes between Qadarite, Jabriti, and emerging Sunni schools produced extensive literature. These writings focused on agency, causality, and knowledge. Surviving treatises display careful logical structure and restrained tone. Manuscripts from these debates contain diagrams, summaries, and marginal cross-references. Copyists preserved these materials with attention to accuracy. Some volumes include tables outlining positions and responses. These features indicate technical engagement rather than popular storytelling. Ottoman scholars continued this analytical tradition. Writers such as Khatib Çelebi surveyed earlier theological works in bibliographic compilations. He recorded differing positions while emphasizing their reliance on scripture and early authority. Educational programs in madrasas included predestination within theology curricula. Students memorized creeds, studied commentaries, and practiced formal disputation. Examination notes preserved in some manuscripts show standardized formulations of key principles. Modern academic research confirms the continuity of these teachings. Studies of Ottoman and Safavid syllabi reveal consistent treatment of ajal and qadar. Predestination appears as a defined doctrine with established interpretive boundaries. Contemporary Quranic commentaries written in Arabic, Turkish, and Urdu follow similar patterns. They cite early interpreters and classical theologians. Explanations emphasize divine knowledge and measured timing while avoiding speculative detail. 20th century fatwa collections reaffirm these positions. Religious authorities state that lifespan is fixed by divine decree, while individuals remain responsible for their actions. These rulings rely on classical sources rather than reinterpretation. Digital text corpora now allow scholars to trace references to Azrael across thousands of works. Computational studies show stable usage over centuries in legal, theological, and historical literature. The term appears in consistent semantic contexts. Within this intellectual environment, references to appointed terms required little elaboration. Time was already treated as structured and verifiable. Religious language reflected this shared framework. Discussions of destiny therefore developed alongside practical systems of chronology. Both relied on precision, continuity, and documentation. The resulting vocabulary for life and death remained controlled and methodical. How death was publicly recorded. The burial plots in the municipal cemeteries established during the Ottoman period were often mapped and numbered. Caretakers maintained notebooks recording the location of each grave, the name of the deceased, and the date of burial. These notebooks were stored in mosque offices or attached to local courts. Access to them was necessary when families sought confirmation of burial sites years later. Written documentation of death formed part of everyday legal practice. When a person died, relatives appeared before a judge to register inheritance claims. The court clerk recorded the death as a preliminary fact before dividing property. Without this entry, legal proceedings could not begin. Sharia court registers from cities such as Jerusalem, Cairo, Damascus, and Bursa preserve thousands of such records. Entries follow standardized formulas. They identify the deceased by name, lineage, occupation, and residence. Dates are given according to the lunar calendar. Witnesses are listed when required. These registers were kept continuously. Judges were replaced, but clerks maintained the same books. Over decades, volumes accumulated in courthouse archives. Modern historians studying demographic change rely on these materials to track mortality patterns and family structures. Mosques played a parallel role in recording deaths. In many urban centres, imams kept lists of community members for funeral prayers. These lists sometimes included notes on causes of death, age, and burial location. Some were later bound into registers. In Cairo, several 19th century mosque death registers survive in manuscript form. They document daily funeral prayers conducted at major mosques such as Al-Azhar. Entries list names, dates, and neighbourhoods. These records supplement court archives and provide independent verification. Biographical dictionaries constituted another major form of death documentation. Scholars compiled large reference works listing notable figures with birth and death dates. Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat, written in the 9th century, established an early model. Later authors expanded this format across disciplines. Al-Dahabi's Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, completed in the 14th century, contains thousands of biographies. Each entry includes a death date, place, and circumstances when available. These details were gathered through correspondence, student reports, and archival consultation. Similar works appeared in regional contexts. In Andalusia, Ibn al-Faradi compiled biographical notices. In Central Asia, al-Samani recorded scholarly lineages. These texts functioned as collective memory systems. Obituary notices also circulated in manuscript newsletters and court announcements. During the Mamluk and Ottoman periods, official scribes sometimes issued written notices for prominent figures. These were posted in mosques and marketplaces. Few survive intact, but references appear in chronicles. Funerary inscriptions provided a durable public record. Gravestones typically include name, lineage, date of death, and Quranic verses. Archaeological surveys in Istanbul, Fez, and Aleppo show standardized epitaph formulas evolving over centuries. Epigraphic studies reveal that dates were carefully calculated. Errors were sometimes corrected by later engravers. Some stones show overwritten numerals. This indicates ongoing concern for accuracy. In rural areas, documentation was less centralized but still present. Village leaders maintained notebooks recording deaths and land transfers. These were used to settle disputes and calculate tax obligations. Surviving examples from Anatolia and Egypt confirm their existence. European travellers in the 17th and 18th centuries noted these practices. Their travel accounts describe court records and cemetery registers. Some compared them favourably to European parish records of the same period. During the 19th century, modernization reforms expanded civil registration. The Ottoman nüfus system introduced population registers recording births, deaths, and migrations. These registers were updated periodically and stored in provincial offices. Egypt implemented similar systems under Muhammad Ali Pasha. Population surveys included death statistics. Annual reports compiled by administrators summarized mortality data for urban districts. These reforms did not replace earlier practices. Court registers, mosque lists, and biographical works continued to function alongside civil records. Multiple systems operated in parallel. Modern archives preserve large portions of this material. The Ottoman archives in Istanbul contain thousands of population and court registers. Dar al-Wathaiq in Cairo holds similar collections. Researchers use them to reconstruct life expectancy and epidemic patterns. Digital cataloguing has increased accessibility. Projects at Princeton, Leiden, and Istanbul have digitized court records and cemetery inscriptions. Databases allow cross-referencing between different types of sources. Statistical analysis of these materials reveals regional variation in mortality. Urban centers show higher death rates during plague outbreaks. Rural areas exhibit different patterns. Such findings depend on the reliability of public records. Religious institutions continue to maintain funeral documentation. Contemporary mosques keep digital registries of burial services. These are often linked to municipal databases. The persistence of public death records reflects institutional continuity. Legal, religious, and administrative bodies shared responsibility for documentation. Each contributed to collective memory. The convergence of court registers, mosque lists, biographies, and gravestones created overlapping systems of verification. A death could be confirmed through multiple sources. Discrepancies were investigated. Epidemics, statistics, and irregular spikes. In the registers of the Cairo Sharia courts for the year 1517, a noticeable change appears in the frequency of inheritance cases. Entries increase sharply over several months. Many refer to households losing more than one member within a short period. Marginal notes in some volumes indicate unusual congestion in court proceedings. Later, historians associated this pattern with a regional outbreak of plague recorded in contemporary chronicles. Written records of epidemics appear in multiple genres. Court registers document sudden increases in estate divisions. Mosque funeral lists show rising numbers of prayer services. Biographical dictionaries include clusters of deaths within narrow time ranges. Together, these sources allow reconstruction of mortality spikes. One of the earliest systematic observers of epidemic disease in the Islamic world was Ibn Sina, who died in 1037. In his Canon of Medicine, he described symptoms of infectious illness and noted seasonal patterns. Although he did not use statistical methods, his clinical observations influenced later physicians. Chroniclers also monitored outbreaks. Ibn al-Wardi, writing in Aleppo during the Black Death of 1348, recorded daily deaths and burial shortages. His treatise describes how markets closed and graveyards expanded. Similar accounts appear in the works of al-Makrizi in Cairo and Ibn Khaldun in North Africa. Al-Makrizi's histories of 15th century Egypt include detailed references to famine and plague. He cited grain prices, burial rates, and administrative responses. His numerical estimates, while approximate, demonstrate attention to scale. Court records from Damascus during the 14th century show temporary changes in procedure. Judges shortened hearings and expedited inheritance cases. Scribes used abbreviated formulas to manage volume. These adjustments appear only during epidemic periods. In Ottoman Istanbul, registers from the 16th and 17th centuries record recurring waves of plague. Population surveys and tax registers show sudden declines followed by gradual recovery. Municipal ordinances issued during outbreaks restricted movement and trade. European consular reports from Ottoman ports corroborate these patterns. Venetian and French diplomats sent mortality reports to their governments. These documents often match figures found in local registers. By the 18th century, administrators began compiling more systematic statistics. In Egypt, provincial governors ordered periodic population counts. Death totals were reported to central offices. Similar practices emerged in Ottoman provinces. The 19th century introduced formal public health monitoring. Quarantine boards were established in ports such as Alexandria, Smyrna, and Istanbul. Ships were inspected. Deaths from infectious disease were recorded separately. Annual health reports from the late Ottoman period list causes of death, age groups and districts. These documents survive in state archives. They reflect the adoption of European statistical models. Famine also produced irregular mortality patterns. During the Egyptian famine of 1784-1785, court records show sharp increases in property sales and inheritance disputes. Al-Jabati's chronicle documents starvation deaths and migration. Wars created similar disruptions. During the Ottoman-Safavid conflicts of the 16th century, provincial registers in eastern Anatolia show population loss. Tax exemptions were granted to depopulated villages. These measures were recorded officially. In the First World War, Ottoman civil registers document large-scale mortality from combat, disease, and displacement. Population statistics compiled between 1914 and 1918 reflect these losses. Post-war censuses attempted to account for missing persons. Statistical analysis of these records reveals recurring features. Epidemics produce rapid spikes followed by administrative overload. Famine leads to prolonged, elevated mortality. War creates irregular and region-specific patterns. Historians reconstruct these trends by comparing multiple sources. Court registers, tax records, burial lists, and diplomatic correspondence are analysed together. Discrepancies are cross-checked. Modern demographic studies use these materials to estimate life expectancy and population growth. Researchers apply mathematical models to incomplete data sets. Results are published in peer-reviewed journals. Digital humanities projects now aggregate epidemic data across regions. Mapping software visualizes mortality waves moving along trade routes. These projects rely on archived registers and chronicles. Contemporary public health institutions in the Middle East continue similar practices. Ministries of health publish mortality statistics and outbreak reports. These follow standardized international formats. The historical record shows that abnormal death patterns were consistently documented. Institutions adapted procedures to manage increased volume. Numerical awareness developed gradually. Epidemics and crises exposed the capacity and limits of record systems. Periods of stability allowed refinement. Periods of disruption tested resilience. Private records and family archives. Bundles of handwritten papers were often stored in wooden chests, ceramic jars, or cloth-wrapped packages. These collections were kept in bedrooms, storage rooms, or near prayer spaces. They were not arranged for public inspection. Access was usually limited to close relatives. Over time, these papers formed informal family archives. Unlike court registers or mosque lists, private records were not standardized. Each household developed its own methods. Some families organized documents chronologically, others grouped them by subject. Some kept loose sheets folded together, others stitched pages into small notebooks. The form depended on literacy, resources, and local custom. Inheritance documents were among the most common items preserved. When property was divided, families often kept copies of court rulings, witness statements, and settlement agreements. These papers were consulted decades later during disputes. In rural Anatolia and Upper Egypt, historians have found inheritance files dating back 3 or 4 generations. Marriage contracts were also carefully preserved. These documents recorded dowries, witnesses, and conditions agreed upon by both families. Because they affected property and lineage, they were treated as essential records. Some contracts include annotations added years later, noting births, relocations, or deaths. Personal correspondence formed another major category. Letters exchanged between family members contained information about illness, travel, financial hardship, and deaths. In merchant families, business letters were often stored alongside personal ones. These collections provide indirect evidence of mortality through routine communication. Diaries were less common but not rare. Educated individuals sometimes kept daily or weekly journals. These writings recorded weather, visitors, religious observance, and family events. Deaths were usually noted briefly, often without commentary. A typical entry might read, "My uncle Hassan passed away before dawn," followed by the next day's activities. One example is the diary of Ahmad ibn Yusuf, a merchant in 18th century Aleppo. Preserved in fragments, his notebooks record household expenses, trade journeys, and family matters. Several entries note the deaths of children and relatives, identified only by name and date. No explanation is offered. Household account books also functioned as records of life events. These ledgers tracked food purchases, rent, wages, and charitable donations. When a family member died, funeral expenses appeared as entries. Payments to grave diggers, shroud sellers, and prayer leaders were recorded alongside routine expenses. In some regions, families maintained genealogical lists. These documents traced ancestry and recorded births and deaths. They were especially common among scholarly, tribal, and notable families. Genealogies were updated periodically and copied for younger generations. In Yemen, Hadrami families preserved such genealogies in bound volumes. These texts list names with birth and death years, migration routes, and marriages. Researchers studying Hadrami diaspora communities rely on these private records. Similar practices existed in Morocco among scholarly lineages. Family libraries contain notebooks documenting teacher-student relationships, marriages, and deaths. These records reinforced social status and continuity. Women played a significant role in maintaining household archives. In many families, women managed marriage contracts, birth records, and correspondence. Oral interviews conducted by historians in Egypt and Palestine indicate that older women often knew where documents were stored and how they were organized. Dowry lists provide another form of private documentation. These inventories recorded household goods transferred at marriage. When a spouse died, these lists were consulted to determine property rights. Surviving examples from 19th century Syria include marginal notes recording subsequent deaths. Photographs became part of family archives in the late 19th century. Studio portraits, funeral photographs, and group images were stored with papers. Some photographs include handwritten notes on the back indicating names and dates of death. In Ottoman cities, middle-class families sometimes created scrapbooks. These combine newspaper clippings, invitations, letters, and obituaries. Such albums preserve public and private information in a single object. Private cemetery maps were also maintained by some families. In large urban graveyards, families recorded plot locations in notebooks. These maps ensured that relatives could locate graves over generations. During periods of displacement, family archives became portable. Refugees fleeing war or famine often carried bundles of documents with them. These papers served as proof of identity and lineage. Armenian, Palestinian, and Circassian families preserved such collections through multiple migrations. In the 20th century, notarial practices expanded, but private archiving continued. Families kept copies of birth certificates, death certificates, and residency permits. These documents were added to older collections rather than replacing them. Researchers studying household archives emphasize their fragility. Paper deteriorates quickly in humid climates. Fires, floods, and insects destroyed many collections. What survives often does so by chance. In Lebanon, civil war damage led to the loss of thousands of family archives. Similar losses occurred during conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Surviving materials are therefore unevenly distributed. Some private archives entered public institutions. Descendants donated collections to libraries and universities. The Al-Azhar Library, the National Library of Egypt, and the Suleymaniye Library hold family papers alongside official records. Cataloguing these collections presents challenges. Documents are often undated. Handwriting varies. References are internal. Archivists rely on contextual clues to reconstruct timelines. Anthropologists have studied how families interpret their own archives. Interviews show that documents are associated with memory and legitimacy. A paper confirming a death can settle disputes. It can also preserve narratives about responsibility and inheritance. In rural Tunisia, field researchers observed families consulting old notebooks during land disputes. These notebooks contained handwritten lists of ancestors and death dates. Judges sometimes accepted them as supporting evidence. Private archives also include religious materials. Prayer books, Qurans, and devotional texts often contain handwritten notes recording births and deaths. Owners used blank pages to mark family events. Such annotations appear in manuscripts dating back centuries. In some Qurans preserved in Bosnian households, marginal notes list multiple generations. These notes provide continuous records spanning the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian periods. Travel journals form another category. Pilgrims and traders documented journeys to Mecca, Cairo, and Istanbul. Deaths occurring during travel were recorded for family reference. These notes informed later inheritance claims. Business ledgers maintained by merchant families recorded partner deaths, debt settlements, and succession arrangements. In port cities such as Alexandria and Izmir, these ledgers link commercial and personal history. Wills were central to private record systems. Although formally registered with courts, families often kept copies. Wills specified burial instructions, charitable bequests, and guardianship arrangements. Marginal notes sometimes record when provisions were fulfilled. Children's notebooks occasionally served archival functions. In literate households, older children copied family histories as writing exercises. Some of these notebooks survive as hybrid educational and documentary texts. Modern oral history projects rely heavily on private archives. Interviewees often produce documents to support memories. Researchers photograph letters, notebooks, and certificates for analysis. Digital technology has changed archival practices. Families now scan old papers and store them on computers or cloud platforms. Social media pages sometimes function as memorial archives, preserving photographs and dates. Despite these changes, continuity remains. The impulse to preserve evidence of death persists. Families continue to maintain records independently of state systems. Scholars analysing private archives emphasise their complementarity with public records. Court registers provide formal confirmation. Family papers supply context. Together, they create layered documentation. In demographic research, private records help fill gaps. Where public archives are missing, family papers can establish timelines. Studies in rural Morocco and Sudan have relied on such materials. The content of private archives reflects social priorities. Property, lineage, and reputation dominate. Emotional expression is limited. Death is recorded as a fact rather than an event. Linguistic analysis of diaries and letters shows consistent phrasing. Death is often noted with formulaic expressions. These formulas resemble those used in official documents, indicating cross-influence. Private records also reveal discrepancies. Dates sometimes differ from court entries. Names may be spelled differently. Researchers compare sources to resolve inconsistencies. Preservation practices vary by region. In humid coastal areas, documents were often recopied. In dry inland regions, original papers survived longer. Climate influenced archival survival. Some families appointed informal custodians. These individuals maintained archives and mediated access. Their role resembled that of community archivists. During colonial periods, new documentation requirements emerged. Identity cards, residence permits, and work licenses entered family archives. Deaths were recorded through both colonial and local systems. In British-controlled Egypt, families kept copies of municipal death certificates alongside Islamic court records. These parallel systems created overlapping documentation. Migration produced hybrid archives. North African families in France and Turkish families in Germany preserved documents from multiple jurisdictions. Death records cross borders. Psychological studies indicate that families view archives as stabilizing resources. They provide continuity during upheaval. They support claims to belonging. Historians emphasize that private archives are not neutral. Documents are selected, some papers are discarded, others are preserved deliberately. These choices shape historical memory. In Palestine, families displaced in 1948 preserved property deeds and death certificates as evidence of pre-war residence. These archives became political instruments. Similar patterns appear among Kurdish, Assyrian, and Rohingya communities. Private archives function as proof of existence. University-based archival projects increasingly collaborate with families. Programs in Jordan and Morocco train communities to preserve documents. Workshops teach digitization and storage techniques. Ethical issues arise in using private archives. Consent, privacy, and ownership must be negotiated. Researchers often restrict access to sensitive materials. The study of family archives requires interdisciplinary methods. Historians, anthropologists, and archivists collaborate. They analyze handwriting, paper quality, and narrative structure. Funding agencies now support preservation initiatives. Grants from UNESCO and national institutions finance digitization of private collections. Despite institutional involvement, most private archives remain in homes. They are maintained through routine practices rather than formal policy. These archives record death through everyday writing: a note in a ledger, a line in a diary, a folded certificate. Each represents an act of documentation. Over generations, such records accumulate. They link individuals to ancestors and descendants. They situate death within family continuity. The existence of these archives demonstrates that record-keeping was not confined to institutions. Households participated actively in documentation. Public and private systems interacted continuously. Court decisions referenced family papers. Families cited court rulings. Information circulated between spheres. Through letters, notebooks, certificates, and ledgers, families preserved evidence of life and death. These materials form an essential component of historical reconstruction. They reveal how individuals understood responsibility, memory, and legitimacy. Death was recorded not only for legal purposes but for continuity. Private archives therefore functioned as parallel record systems. They reinforced official documentation and preserved additional detail. Their survival allows modern researchers to study mortality at the household level. Patterns emerge through aggregation. The quiet persistence of these practices shows how deeply embedded documentation was in social life. Recording death was part of ordinary administration. Archives, databases, and digital consolidation. Rows of scanners now stand where copying desks once operated. Archivists feed fragile manuscripts, court registers, and population lists into digital imaging systems. Each page is photographed, indexed, and assigned a reference code. The process is slow and regulated. Handling procedures are documented, lighting levels are measured, every step is recorded. Large-scale digitization projects began in the Middle East and North Africa during the late 20th century. In Egypt, the National Archives initiated scanning programs in the 1990s. Turkey's Ottoman archives followed with similar efforts in the early 2000s. These programs focused first on court registers, population surveys, and tax records. Death-related documentation formed a major portion of the material. Digitization served multiple purposes. It reduced physical handling of fragile documents. It created backup copies. It enabled remote access for researchers. It also introduced new systems of classification. Each scanned document is entered into a database. Metadata fields record date, location, document type, language, and subject. Names are transcribed when possible. Place names are standardized. Variant spellings are cross-referenced. This process transforms handwritten material into searchable data. In Istanbul, the Presidency of State Archives manages millions of digital files. Ottoman court registers, census books, and burial records are stored in centralized servers. Researchers access them through controlled terminals. Similar systems operate in Cairo, Rabat, and Tehran. European and North American institutions participate in parallel projects. Libraries at Princeton, Leiden, and Cambridge have digitized Middle Eastern manuscript collections. Many of these contain biographical dictionaries and private papers documenting deaths. International agreements regulate data sharing. One major challenge is handwriting recognition. Classical Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, and Persian scripts vary widely by period and scribe. Automated recognition software remains unreliable. As a result, most transcription is manual. Teams of trained readers enter data line by line. This work is time-intensive. A single court register may contain thousands of entries. Each must be reviewed. Errors are flagged. Supervisors conduct random audits. Accuracy standards are formalized in internal manuals. Once entered, data can be aggregated. Death dates from different regions and centuries are compiled. Geographic coordinates are added. Statistical tools analyze frequency patterns. Researchers use these datasets to study epidemics, migration, and demographic change. Digital consolidation also reveals inconsistencies. When records from different institutions are compared, discrepancies appear. A death recorded in a court register may differ from a cemetery inscription. Database systems allow these conflicts to be documented rather than concealed. International projects such as the Islamic Manuscripts Reference Library and the Open ITI initiative seek to harmonize cataloging practices. They develop shared metadata standards. These standards ensure that a biographical entry in Cairo can be matched with one in Leiden. Private archives increasingly enter digital systems. Families donate scanned copies of letters and certificates to heritage projects. In Morocco and Jordan, community archiving programs train residents to digitize household records. These files are uploaded to regional repositories. Colonial-era records are also integrated. French, British, and Italian administrative archives contain death statistics from former territories. These are digitized and linked to local sources. The result is multi-jurisdictional documentation. Health ministries contribute modern data. Civil registration systems record deaths electronically. These records are linked to older archives through retrospective digitization. Long-term mortality databases now span several centuries in some regions. Privacy regulations govern access. Sensitive personal data is restricted. Researchers must submit proposals and ethics reviews. Access levels are tiered. Some records are viewable only in anonymized form. Despite these controls, digital consolidation changes the nature of historical research. Where earlier scholars consulted individual volumes, modern researchers analyze thousands of records simultaneously. Statistical methods replace anecdotal comparison. Digital platforms also preserve marginalia and annotations. High-resolution images capture faded ink and erased corrections. Scholars can examine layers of writing without physical handling. This preserves evidence of earlier editorial practices. Funding for these projects comes from multiple sources. Governments allocate cultural preservation budgets. International foundations provide grants. Universities contribute technical support. Sustainability plans are required for long-term storage. Data storage itself presents challenges. Servers require maintenance. Formats become obsolete. Migration to new systems is periodic. Archival departments employ specialists in digital preservation to manage these transitions. Errors introduced during digitization are documented. Correction protocols exist. Users can submit reports. Editorial boards review proposed changes. Version histories are maintained. Artificial intelligence tools are gradually introduced. Pattern recognition assists in identifying names and dates. These tools operate under human supervision. Their output is treated as provisional. Cross-database linking is expanding. A death entry in a Cairo court register may now be connected to a biographical dictionary in Damascus and a cemetery survey in Istanbul. These links are created through shared identifiers. Digital consolidation also alters public access. Online portals allow non-specialists to consult historical death records. Genealogical research has expanded as a result. Families trace lineages using state archives. Educational institutions incorporate these databases into curricula. Students learn archival research through digital interfaces. Training manuals emphasize source evaluation and verification. International standards bodies develop guidelines for historical data management. These include citation formats, preservation protocols, and interoperability requirements. Compliance is monitored through audits. The shift from dispersed manuscripts to centralized databases represents a structural change in documentation. Records that once existed in isolated collections now operate within unified systems. This does not eliminate uncertainty. Gaps remain. Lost documents cannot be restored. Digitization reflects surviving material rather than complete history. Nevertheless, digital consolidation enables long-term comparison. Mortality trends can be traced across dynasties, empires, and modern states. Patterns become visible through aggregation. Archival institutions continue to expand these systems. New collections are added annually. Private donors contribute material. Technical infrastructure evolves. The documentation of death has thus entered a new phase. Inscription has moved from paper to data fields. Registers have become relational tables. Marginal notes have become metadata tags. The underlying function remains consistent. Names, dates, and places are preserved. Verification remains central. Continuity is maintained through technological adaptation. Digital archives now function as composite records. They integrate legal, religious, private, and medical sources. Each layer retains its origin while contributing to a unified structure. The transformation reflects administrative priorities. Efficiency, accessibility, and durability guide design. Historical caution is translated into digital protocols. Through scanning, indexing and cross-referencing, dispersed records are consolidated. Documentation becomes simultaneously more centralized and more accessible. Institutional memory and the authority of the record. Authority is not assigned to an object but to a source. A statement becomes binding only when it can be traced to a recognized origin. For matters of death, this distinction has remained consistent across centuries. The Quran establishes that death occurs at a fixed term and that an appointed angel carries it out. What follows from that foundation is carefully limited. Anything beyond it requires verification. Classical scholars treated knowledge of death as belonging to different levels. One level was divine knowledge, described as complete and unalterable. Another level was human knowledge, which relied on testimony, observation, and documentation. Confusion between these levels was avoided through strict methodological rules. When later literature introduced descriptions of lists, tablets, or registers connected to death, scholars evaluated these claims through established criteria. They examined chains of transmission, compared wording across texts, and classified reports according to reliability. Only material supported by primary sources was granted doctrinal authority. Works of creed illustrate this restraint. Texts such as the Tahawi Creed affirm belief in divine decree and the appointed term without describing how deaths are recorded. Commentators explain that the absence of detail was deliberate. Matters not specified in Revelation were not to be elaborated upon. Legal scholars applied similar principles. In rulings concerning inheritance or liability, death was treated as a fact confirmed through evidence, not through speculation about unseen records. Courts required testimony and documentation. The unseen was acknowledged but not operationalized. The concept of a preserved record appears in Quranic language describing divine knowledge. Scholars interpreted this as affirmation of completeness, rather than an endorsement of a literal book accessible to angels or humans. The record signified certainty, not procedure. When the name Azrael and associated imagery circulated in narrative literature, institutional scholarship did not absorb these elements into formal doctrine. They remained outside creeds, legal manuals, and authenticated hadith collections. Their authority was cultural rather than theological. This separation is visible in educational curricula. Students memorized texts that defined belief without reference to named death registers. Instructors emphasized what could be affirmed and where silence was required. Examination manuals reflect this boundary. Manuscript traditions reinforce the pattern. Marginal notes in theological texts frequently mark narrative embellishments as weak or unverified. Scribes preserved the main text while isolating uncertain material. Over time, this practice stabilized authoritative language. Institutional memory depends on repetition under rules. Concepts confirmed by scripture and consensus are repeated across generations. Unverified descriptions remain peripheral. The idea of a comprehensive divine record persists, while the form of that record is left undefined. Modern religious authorities maintain the same position. Official statements affirm belief in divine decree and the angel of death as described in the Quran. They avoid endorsing specific names or descriptions absent from primary sources. This approach mirrors classical methodology. Academic studies confirm this continuity. Analyses of theological literature show remarkable consistency in how death is discussed. Core principles remain unchanged, while narrative additions fluctuate by time and place. The authority of the record, within this framework, does not rest on imagery but on source. Divine knowledge is affirmed as complete. Human knowledge is recognized as limited. The boundary between them is preserved through method. This structure prevents accumulation of speculative detail. It also explains why no single text describing a literal book of deaths achieved canonical status. The concept remained an interpretive image rather than an institutional doctrine. Across centuries, scholars return to the same foundation. Death occurs by permission at an appointed term. It is carried out by an assigned angel. Beyond this, certainty ends. Institutional memory preserved that limit. Through creeds, courts, curricula, and commentary, the scope of authoritative knowledge remained controlled. The unseen was acknowledged without being itemized. The persistence of this restraint is itself documented. It appears in manuscripts, legal rulings, educational texts, and modern fatwas. Each generation reaffirmed the same boundaries. In this way, the idea of a record connected to death remained abstract. It signified order without description. Authority rested not in imagined detail, but in verified source. Continuity without detail. Shelves contain works copied centuries apart that speak about death in nearly identical language. Manuscripts from the 10th century sit beside printed editions from the 20th. Despite differences in script, format, and binding, the phrasing remains consistent. Death is described as occurring at an appointed term. It is attributed to divine permission. The mechanism is not expanded. The boundaries of description remain stable. This continuity did not emerge by accident. It was maintained through educational systems, legal institutions, and scholarly conventions that emphasized restraint. Each generation inherited not only texts, but also methods for interpreting them. These methods defined what could be affirmed and what must remain unspecified. From the earliest period, religious instruction relied on memorization of foundational texts. Students learned Quranic verses relating to life and death. They memorized creeds that summarized accepted beliefs. These materials were repeated in mosques, schools, and private study circles. Their wording changed little over time. Commentaries expanded on these texts, but expansion followed rules. Authors cited earlier authorities. They distinguished between reliable and weak reports. They recorded disagreements without resolving them through speculation. The result was cumulative explanation without cumulative invention. The chain of transmission played a central role in this process. Teachers certified students. Students copied books under supervision. Certificates of transmission recorded who had studied which texts and with whom. This system preserved not only content but interpretive boundaries. When political regimes changed, these scholarly networks often remained intact. The Abbasid Caliphate gave way to regional dynasties. The Mamluks replaced the Ayyubids. The Ottomans absorbed earlier states. In each transition, legal schools, theological curricula, and library collections continued functioning. Court systems also reinforced continuity. Judges applied inherited legal doctrines. They relied on established manuals. Death was treated as a legal fact verified through testimony and documentation. Courts did not reference speculative descriptions of unseen records. Their language remained procedural. During periods of crisis, this stability was tested. Plagues, wars, and migrations disrupted institutions. Libraries were damaged, scholars were displaced. Yet surviving communities rebuilt using familiar frameworks. New copies of old texts were produced, curricula were restored. The Black Death of the 14th century provides one example. Mortality rates rose dramatically. Scholars wrote about the epidemic. They discussed medical and theological aspects. Yet core doctrines about predestination and appointed terms were restated rather than revised. The Ottoman period demonstrates similar patterns. As the empire expanded, it incorporated diverse populations. New administrative systems were introduced. Printing technology was adopted. Despite these changes, theological language about death remained restrained. Ottoman madrasas taught the same creeds used in earlier centuries. Students studied al-Tahawi, al-Nasafi, and their commentaries. These texts affirmed divine decree without detailing unseen mechanisms. The emphasis was on continuity. Printing amplified this effect. When classical works were published in Cairo and Istanbul during the 19th century, editors selected established commentaries. Marginal notes were standardized. Variant readings were compared. The printed page fixed authoritative versions. Colonial rule introduced new administrative structures. European powers imposed civil registration systems. Medical certification became more prominent. Statistical reporting expanded. These changes affected documentation, but not doctrine. Religious scholars responded by distinguishing between administrative procedure and theological belief. A death certificate might require medical cause. Belief in divine decree remained unchanged. Each domain retained its own authority. After independence, many states retained colonial-era registration systems. Ministries of Health and Interior took over. Electronic databases replaced paper ledgers. Yet religious instruction continued to use inherited texts. In universities and seminaries, students still study classical commentaries. Digital editions are used, but the content is familiar. Lectures emphasize limits of knowledge. Examinations test recognition of boundaries. The persistence of this approach is visible in modern fatwa collections. When asked about details of angels or divine records, scholars cite Quranic verses and authenticated traditions. They caution against affirming unverified reports. Their wording resembles that of medieval authorities. Online platforms have not altered this pattern significantly. Religious websites reproduce classical answers. Databases link to early sources. The same boundaries are maintained in digital form. Academic research has documented this continuity. Comparative studies of theological literature show minimal change in core formulations. New terminology appears, but underlying structure remains. One reason for this stability lies in the classification of knowledge. Classical scholars divided knowledge into categories. Revealed knowledge had highest authority. Rational analysis operated within its limits. Narrative material occupied a lower tier. Descriptions of death registers, named angels, or detailed mechanisms were consistently placed in this lower tier. They could be mentioned as cultural material, but not treated as doctrine. This hierarchy prevented escalation. Institutional practices reinforced the hierarchy. Publishing houses favoured recognised texts. Examination boards selected canonical works. Libraries prioritised authoritative editions. Funding supported preservation of established material. The result was a selective transmission process. Some ideas circulated widely. Others remained peripheral. The idea of a comprehensive divine record persisted. Its form remained undefined. Political ideology also played a role. Rulers often promoted religious stability. Supporting established doctrines reduced controversy. Novel theological speculation could provoke disputes. Continuity was administratively convenient. During reform movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, calls for renewal often involved returning to primary sources. Reformers criticized unverified traditions. They reinforced early methodological standards. This further stabilized boundaries. Salafi movements emphasized strict reliance on Quran and authentic hadith. Traditionalist scholars defended classical consensus. Despite differences, both groups rejected speculative elaboration about unseen matters. Modern educational reforms have not altered this substantially. Curricula may include sociology or history, but theological instruction remains conservative. Students learn what is affirmed and what is withheld. Diaspora communities follow similar patterns. Mosques in Europe and North America use translated classical texts. Sermons repeat standard formulations. Cultural adaptations occur, but doctrinal limits remain. Psychological and sociological studies suggest that such stability provides cognitive reassurance. Clear boundaries reduce uncertainty. Ambiguity is managed through silence rather than elaboration. The continuity also reflects archival survival. Texts that conform to methodological norms were copied and preserved. Works containing excessive speculation were less frequently reproduced. Survival shaped authority. Manuscript studies show that heavily copied works tend to avoid detailed metaphysical imagery. They focus on principles. Less restrained texts appear in fewer copies. Some survive only in fragments. Private libraries followed similar patterns. Scholars collected authoritative works. Students borrowed canonical commentaries. Marginal notes reinforced accepted interpretations. Family archives sometimes preserved devotional texts containing narrative material. These circulated at a popular level. They rarely entered institutional curricula. The separation persisted. The concept of a divine record illustrates this dynamic. Quranic language affirms inscription and preservation. Scholars interpret this as indicating completeness. Popular literature imagines lists and books. Institutions maintain abstraction. Over centuries, this arrangement remained functional. It allowed religious discourse to acknowledge order without committing to imagery. It permitted cultural expression without altering doctrine. Technological change has not disrupted this structure. Digitization reproduces classical texts. Search engines retrieve established commentaries. Artificial intelligence tools are trained on canonical corpora. Even when new questions arise, responses follow familiar patterns. Scholars cite early authorities. They restate boundaries. They decline to speculate. Continuity is reproduced. Institutional memory operates through layered mechanisms. Texts transmit content. Teaching transmits method. Certification transmits authority. Archiving transmits legitimacy. Each layer reinforces restraint. This structure also manages disagreement. Different schools may emphasize foreknowledge or decree. They debate causality, yet they share limits on description. Disputes remain internal to established frameworks. The absence of a detailed canonical Book of Deaths is therefore not an omission. It is a result of deliberate method. What cannot be verified is not elaborated. Across political collapse, colonial intervention, technological revolution, and globalization, this method persisted. It adapted form without changing substance. The continuity is visible in language. Phrases recur across centuries, appointed term, by permission, according to decree. These formulations remain central. It is visible in pedagogy. Students still memorize the same passages. They still learn where explanation ends. It is visible in administration. Courts still treat death as a documented fact. Religious institutions still treat it as divinely ordered. It is visible in scholarship. Researchers still distinguish between scripture, commentary, and narrative. This persistence suggests that restraint became an institutional value. Elaborating unseen mechanisms was viewed as unnecessary and potentially misleading. In practical terms, this meant that no authority claimed access to a literal register of deaths. No institution presented itself as interpreter of such a record. The idea remained symbolic. Libraries preserve thousands of volumes discussing death. They do not preserve a canonical text describing a detailed celestial ledger. Educational systems reproduce this silence. Examinations do not test knowledge of imagined records. They test recognition of principles. Legal systems operate independently of such imagery. They require documentation, not metaphysical explanation. Administrative systems likewise focus on verification, not theology. The division of domains has remained stable. Divine knowledge is affirmed. Human knowledge is documented. The boundary is maintained. Over time, this arrangement created a durable intellectual ecosystem. It accommodated cultural imagination without absorbing it. It preserved doctrine without stagnation. The idea associated with Azrael's book remained within this ecosystem as an image, not a source. It circulated in poetry, storytelling, and popular speech. It did not enter creeds. This separation allowed continuity across generations. Children learned basic doctrine. Adults encountered cultural imagery. Scholars maintained boundaries. The system proved resilient. It absorbed external influences without structural change. It integrated new administrative practices without altering belief. In this sense, continuity without detail became a defining feature. Knowledge of death was framed through timing and authority, not through mechanism. The record, in institutional terms, was not a physical object. It was a principle, that nothing occurs outside divine knowledge. How that knowledge is organized was not specified. Silence preserved coherence. Modern digital systems mirror this approach. Databases store death records. They do not claim metaphysical significance. They operate within administrative limits. Religious discourse continues separately. It affirms order without description. The two systems coexist without conflict because their boundaries are clear. Continuity is maintained through restraint. In this way, the record remains present and absent at the same time. It is affirmed and undefined. It is central and inaccessible. The historical evidence shows that this balance was intentional. It was reproduced through teaching, copying, certification, and archiving. Each generation received not only texts but a discipline of silence. That discipline preserved stability. Through empires, reforms, and revolutions, it endured. Through paper, print, and data, it adapted. Through personal belief and public administration, it coordinated. The documentation of death multiplied. The description of its unseen register did not. What remained was a shared understanding that life ends at a measured time, known beyond human access, recorded beyond human reach, and acknowledged without elaboration. If you found this fascinating, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dive videos like this. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.